The fusion of a sperm cell and an egg, smaller than the head of a pin. Yet within this tiny cluster of cells, only a few gestational hours old, are the genetic instructions that will direct the development of a new human being.
You start from an embryo that's less than a millimeter to a fetus 3, 4, 5 centimeters at 10, 11, 12 weeks of gestation. You've grown an awful lot. And so the organs that are basically there are there. They're just not matured.
Throughout the prenatal period, an interplay of environmental and genetic factors impact the rapidly growing fetus.
You want the environment for the baby to be as healthy as possible. So from a physical point of view, a normal amount of exercise, good nutrition, and not exposing yourself to any terrible toxins.
The placenta screens out toxins as it transfers nutrients and oxygen from mother to fetus. However, some substances slip by.
If they smoke in pregnancy, we tend to see changes in the placenta that lead to smaller babies. And that starts to have its effect in the second trimester and even more so in the third trimester. Infections that take place in the first trimester can affect the growth and changes in the second trimester. You talk about measles, you talk about chickenpox. Both of these cause lots of changes. In fact, patients always ask me, I had a fever, I had an infection, can my baby get it? Yeah, your baby can get it.
What is it today?
Because of this close connection between mother and child, doctors recommend total abstinence from alcohol during pregnancy. Even light drinking can affect the fetal brain.
If you think about the toxicity that it has on adults, it's little wonder that alcohol exposure in utero is very toxic. There's usually cognitive impairment associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. There often are behavioral disruptions to the child. So there's disruption or damage across a variety of different aspects of that child.
What about a woman's psychological state during pregnancy? Does it also have an impact on the developing fetus?
Through the ages, people have somehow felt emotional experiences for the mother might affect the baby. But for a while, we just debunked all that. But if you think logically, if the mother relaxes when she listens to Mozart, and her pulse rate slows down, and her entire circulatory system and body is less stressed, this can only be healthy for the baby.
Let's listen to your back.
A high degree of stress is a predictor of health problems, not only during childhood, but later in life.
Changes in the developing brain of the fetus, decreased fetal growth, and if it's born low birth weight or preterm, then these are the babies that tend to have increased incidence of elevated blood pressures during childhood. And then also later on in life, they're at greater risk for heart disease, atherosclerosis, diabetes, and even stroke.
Having endured the hazards of the prenatal environment, newborns enter the world ready for action. Action that is limited at first, but is still critical for survival.
The view of the baby's initial state used to be one of this baby comes into the world not knowing anything, not having any understanding even of the sensations that it's experiencing. Now the vision that has been painted by research over the last couple or 3 decades is really showing that there's a lot of organization. Babies seem to have some understanding of the physical world. They know when they see some shape looming in the visual field, that's actually an object that belongs in the 3-dimensional world out there, that has some spatial relationship to them. They seem to have some understanding and appreciation of the social world. When they see a face and hear a voice, they seem to understand that that's another being, the same kind as them, that they are going to have social interactions with.
From infancy on, brain and mind, neural hardware and cognitive software develop together. And as they do, the child's mental abilities surge ahead.
At birth, the limbic areas are quite underdeveloped, and the cortex almost entirely underdeveloped. Underdeveloped means the neurons are there pretty much, because there's a huge number of neurons produced, but the connections among them have not been established in the cortex.
When you're born, the brain has the capacity, in a sense, to absorb input like a sponge, and it very rapidly evolves. That is to say, the initial processing and sorting of information involves without the child actually in a learning mode, because the child doesn't really have to attend to the sound. The child doesn't really have to make decisions about the sound early on, doesn't even have to be rewarded by the sound. In fact, it's been recently shown that in an infant, uniquely, very different from an older child or an adult, you can actually drive plastic changes in the brain when the child is sleeping.
In biology, the term plastic means open to change due to experience. Experiences children have will allow new synaptic connections to be made, new connections among neurons, maintain the ones that grew before, and if there are experiences that are missing or lacking, then the connections that are there will die away. So it's a use-dependent maintenance of connections that were already established by just the push of genes. Some people have estimated that there are 1 million connections made in the cortex per second. Huge number of genetically pushed connections in the first 6 months of life in the cortex.
Now, this can't happen very long in life because ultimately learning has to be selective. And what happens is that it passes, primarily in the first year of life, out in this early magical period where you could say plasticity is driven just on the basis of exposure to inputs, to a period in which it's modulated or regulated. So in an older brain, changes occur primarily for things that the child or the adult is attending to. And then changes are also modulated as a function of the brightness or alertness of the individual. And they're modulated or regulated as a function of rewards or punishments.
As the infant's muscle and nervous systems mature, more complex skills emerge, one after the other. First sitting, then standing, and walking.
Sensory feedback back from muscles and joints contributes to the development of movement abilities in a child. I mean, we know that some children are very facile, agile, and other children are clumsy and are limited in their movement control, and we've been very interested in that process. And you can't think of those processes in the development of the abilities of a child as simply being explained by, you could say, the muscle control itself. It is a differentiation and elaboration of sensory feedback that comes from the skin and from the muscles themselves and from joints and from the eyes that the brain uses to guide its development of movement.
The age at which a baby learns to sit or walk varies from child to child, a source of concern for some new parents.
You know, they says they want to drive the fastest car, they want to have the fastest baby, and they think you can control that. You know, I'm trying to teach him to stand. But when an infant is ready to do something, you can't stop them. Anyone who has raised children knows when they want to stand or walk, and if you try to sit them down or lie them down, they're not having it. They are so excited about practicing their latest skill. One of the most exciting things about working with children is this tremendous developmental drive. Whatever they know how to do, they want to do all the time.
Boys are more active than girls from about as soon as they start moving around, and that's a moderately large gender difference. Probably it's a combination of biological and social factors. I mean, they found this difference even very early before kids start to walk. Boys will flail their arms around more. One possibility is that it has to do with maturation rate. That is, children learn to control their activity as they get older. Girls mature faster. Their nervous system matures faster than boys. So it could be that girls are just learning to restrain their activity earlier.
Research indicates that human cognition, the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating, also tends to unfold sequentially.
How do young babies think? What are their emotions? How do they interact in the world and try to understand the world and act upon the world?
Such questions so intrigued Jean Piaget that he spent nearly half a century working with children and studying just how they learn. He became convinced that children constantly use their experiences to expand or adjust their understanding of the world. His contention that a child's mind is not merely a scaled-down model of an adult's transformed developmental psychology in the 20th century.
Piaget was very important for giving us an understanding of how the mind of a child grows, and for helping us understand that certain things that are plainly obvious to us are just not comprehended at all by a child whose mind is like on a different planet.
During what Piaget called the sensory motor stage, from birth to nearly age 2, babies take in the world by looking, hearing, touching, and other exploratory techniques. What is out of sight was thought to be out of mind.
A lot of research from the mid-1980s onward has shown that this is really fundamentally wrong.
Papa.
Babies do understand that an object continues to exist once it's out of sight. They also know that objects are solid material entities that can't pass through each other. They take up space. They know that objects can't just blip from location A to location B, like the Star Trek transporter device. And they use these expectations in their reasoning about the events that are unfolding around them.
Let us sing? Yeah, let us sing. Okay, now watch. Now we have the vase.
Piaget believed that during the preschool period, up to age 6 or 7, children are in a pre-operational stage. The child learns to use language, but does not yet comprehend mental operations, like the concept of conservation.
Which one has more? The vase or the cup? The vase. Why do you think the vase has more? Ah!
There's a lot of evidence that language development tends to follow a pretty biologically built-in developmental timetable. Most babies will utter their first word somewhere between 9 and 14 months. Most babies will start what is called the word spurt or word explosion at approximately 18 months, where they start combining words and learning a lot of new words.
What the recent research is showing is that children manage to acquire all of these words quite systematically by relating what they are talking about to the situations that they are in.
Some children talk very early. Some children talk later. Girls typically develop more rapidly than boys. But there's a fairly wide range of what's still normal. The best thing to do for any child is just to give them as rich an environment as possible. Read to them, talk to them, just be as verbal as you can. If the nervous system matures and they're in an environment where they're being talked to, you can't keep a child from learning language. It's just part of what develops as the mind grows.
A team of researchers at the Yale Infant Cognition Laboratory are conducting experiments related to a child's ability to perform mental operations. These skills, they believe, may be further developed than Piaget thought.
Marika, golly, you're in such a good mood.
I first started studying early mathematical development in graduate school and was looking at 2- and 3-year-old children. And I was interested in how do they learn to count, and in particular, when they are counting, how do they learn what these number words mean? It became clear to me after studying these young children for a few years that they were already bringing with them to the task of learning to count some prior concepts of number. That's what led me to start studying young babies and their early numerical capacities. We showed one group of babies a Mickey Mouse doll placed on a display. Up went a screen in front of it to briefly hide that doll, and babies saw a hand coming in, placing another identical Mickey Mouse doll out of sight behind the screen. And our question at that point, of course, is, do they have some expectation as to how many there should be behind the screen? And we simply measured babies' looking time to these different outcomes, because babies look longer at things that are unexpected to them. But more just than simply having expectations that there are some objects behind the screen, they compute the precise number of objects that should be behind the screen.
And watch the movie.
The questions didn't stop with this initial study.
One of the questions that continues to interest us is, what are the kinds of things that babies' counting system can apply to? Is it only individual objects, or can babies count other kinds of things as well? So in one study we showed that babies can count actions. They're sensitive to how many times a puppet jumps. And in another situation, we showed that babies are sensitive to numbers of groups of things. not how many things are in a group.
Some researchers, including Dr. Wynn, see this as an indication that babies have a basic ability to add and subtract. But not all researchers agree.
To the average citizen, the word add means that I have a concept of cardinal numbers, 1 and 1, and 1 and 1 are 2. The baby doesn't have that. So first, they're changing the meaning of add dramatically. But more important, if I do the same experiment, and now when the screen is raised, there are no dolls, babies don't look. Why? If they could add, they should know that no dolls is certainly a violation of 1 plus 1. So I don't believe that babies can add.
Disagreement is a very natural part of science. So as soon as one researcher has a finding and thinks that this is the most logical or even the only interpretation that can be made, some other creative researcher will say, well, actually, here's the following explanation that really could account for those results. That serves a very useful function in that it motivates further experiments to try to tease apart those two competing explanations.
3, 6, 9.
By age 6 or 7, children are able to move beyond simple mathematical operations. They now realize that a change in shape does not necessarily mean a change in quantity. Piaget called this the concrete operational stage.
Can you tell me which one has more?
They're the same.
How do you know they're the same?
Because they started out the same, just this one is taller and thin.
But it still has the same.
As children approach adolescence, Piaget said, they begin to think outside the box of actual experience. In this formal operational stage of thinking, they can deal with abstract issues and solve hypothetical problems. Here, too, some researchers disagree with Piaget's interpretation.
As research has progressed, today's psychologists have come to see the stages as less sharply defined than what Piaget had in mind. And so we now see the glimmerings of some of those later stages of thought at earlier ages than Piaget anticipated.
From the moment of birth, children are social creatures. Infants in all cultures, in all primate species, develop an intense bond with their caregivers, a bond researchers call attachment.
A fellow named John Bowlby, who was a psychoanalyst in England, came up with some ideas with a research psychologist named Mary Ainsworth, and the two of them together developed the essence of attachment theory, that the actual experiences children have in the first years of life shape their sense of themselves, their faith in connections with other people, and their way of perceiving reality, so that as they then march through the rest of development, these early experiences form a foundation for the person's developing personality.
Attachment, however, doesn't just mean holding and being connected. It also means supporting the child as she or he develops. It means allowing them to toddle away and yet being there when they toddle back with joy in your eyes. And similarly, as children get older, supporting them in engaging in age-appropriate growth, and yet always being nurturing and loving and kind and caring.
At the essence, I think, of what a child needs is a parent to have what's called contingent communication. And contingent communication means that a parent, number one, perceives the signals of a child. Number two, the parent has to understand the meaning of those signals and what it means for the internal state of the child. The third aspect of contingency is for the parent to be able to respond in a timely and effective manner so that the child is experiencing a signal from the parent, a touch from the parent, a statement from the parent that shows that the child was seen, understood, and cared about. That's what contingency is. And so at the emotional level, if we had to put words to it, the child then has something which a patient of mine once coined. I love this term. It's called feeling felt. The child feels felt by the parent. Put in other terms, the child can see in the parent's eyes that he or she exists in the parent's mind.
Researchers agree on the importance of the attachment bond. The controversy centers on how best to measure it.
Mary Ainsworth invented a procedure many years ago called a strange situation. And it caught on because everyone wanted to believe you could measure it. In the strange situation, a child and mother, 1 year of age, come to a laboratory, and the mother and the child play for 3 minutes, and then a stranger enters, and then the mother leaves. So now there's this 1-year-old alone in a strange room with a stranger.
And you see tremendous variation in terms of how the child is able to respond, cope with the modest stresses to which he or she is exposed.
And Mary Ainsworth and her students decided that if that child got very upset at that point when the mother left, and when the mother returned, if that child was not soothable, they concluded that child had an insecure attachment. Or if the child did not cry when the mother left, said bye-bye, ignored the mother when she returned, that child was also called insecurely attached. While the child who cried a little, but when the mother came and picked the child up, the child quieted within a few seconds, that child was called securely attached. Now, if that were true, that would be a great discovery. But who's going to be that first group? That's the high reactive infant. So that temperament is the major determiner of whether you're going to scream like crazy when your mother leaves you with a stranger, and then when your mother comes in, you're so upset, it's very hard for you to be soothed. So that strange situation is, in my opinion, not a sensitive measure of the quality of your attachment.
There's definitely this sort of hardwired temperament that plays a factor, and I don't think we can minimize that. But the issue is, how does that temperament interact with the kind of attachment relationships that get formed? And so it's not an either or, but it's a variety of factors that are likely to go into how a child accommodates to those transitions in life.
For many children today, childcare and preschool begin at an early age.
The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development has sponsored this huge consortium study of child care that has looked at a number of sites around the country, looked at consequences for kids. And the results from that study are complex. Mostly they show that kids do just fine, as long as the child care quality is good to excellent. Kids don't do well if it's poor quality child care, but neither do they do well with mothers who don't give very good care. And one of the catches is that when people worry about child care, they always compare bad child care against idealized mothers. And not all mothers are great mothers.
But suboptimal attachment, whether it's with a daycare setting or your own parent, can inhibit the capacity of a child to feel good about him or herself, and then to go out and be able to regulate themselves enough to tolerate frustration, to pay attention, to have these executive control systems, which are part of the same part of the brain, be able to maintain flexible responses, good relationships with others, understand how to tolerate frustration, all these things that are fundamental to learning.
By the end of childhood, most children have developed a sense of themselves as individuals, unique and apart from others they know and see. Just when and how does this sense of self develop?
The general consensus of researchers who study social and emotional development is that a young child doesn't really develop a sense of self until about 2 years of age. And what they mean by a sense of self is the ability to understand that they are distinct from others and that they might be the recipient of others' attention and emotions. My own view departs significantly from the general consensus. Researchers have tended to look at infants' reactions in the social world more as if they are kind of passive reflections of what the infant is experiencing, which they are to some extent, but they are also active attempts to influence the social interaction, and I think that has not been emphasized. Another way where some of my own views depart company is the notion of social emotions. Embarrassment, jealousy, guilt, pride, shame, emotions that are kind of inherently tied to the social world. This whole host of social emotions requires a sense of self, because you have to have your idea of the self, your idea of the other, and the notion that yourself is a recipient of others' attentions and judgments. So a baby considerably younger than 2 will show what, to all intents and purposes, seems to be pride at having achieved something, like pulling himself up on a coffee table and standing, give a great beam of joy and pride at his achievement, and look to his parents or other adults as if to wish to share this achievement with them.
I saw this. You saw that.
But then as the child develops closer to around 5 to 7 years of age, she or he can just start developing what Catherine Nelson calls autobiographical memory, and that's where you have larger assemblies of these episodes of experience that generate a feeling of self across time. This issue of making sense of your life is so important that I spent time with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, putting together an actual book which not only summarizes it but gives parents a pathway to making sense of their lives and parenting from the inside out.
What's the first one?
This raises an important question. In what ways does parenting style affect a child's self-concept?
Correlational research has found, for example, that children who are raised not in a laissez-faire method, nor in a very strict authoritarian method, but with authoritative parenting, that is child-centered but also has high expectations for the child, those children tend to develop a strong sense of self-esteem and to thrive in many ways. Is that an effect of the parenting, or is that a result of the shared genes of very competent parents and their very competent children? That's something that's still up for debate.
So it makes sense for us as a society to support processes by which adults can make sense of their own lives so that they can actually provide for the children what those children desperately need to then establish themselves in a secure and solid fashion to be contributors to society and also to participate in healthy relationships in the future.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.